And so this is the paradox, right? This is a paradox of perfectionism. On the one hand, you've got all this restless striving, but then on the other hand, you've got all of this burnout and this self-sabotage, and they converge to mean that perfectionists are no more successful than other people. And that's a really difficult message to spread.
Welcome to Success Reimagined. I am Dr. Amna Shabbir, your host on this journey to thrive at the intersection of ambition and wellness. In every episode, I'll help you challenge outdated definitions of success, discover practical tools and strategies for growth without compromising your well-being. I am so glad you've joined me. Let's reimagine what's possible together. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Thomas Curran, the leading global expert on perfectionism. Dr. Curran is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and his research has shaped much of what we understand about modern rise of perfectionism. His work has been featured in The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and many other publications. One of his most well-known studies, a 2017 meta-analysis conducted with Andrew Hill, examined data from over 40,000 college students and revealed a sharp rise in perfectionist tendencies over the last few decades. This study, one of the largest of its kind, suggests that our culture's increasing emphasis on competition, achievement, and unrealistic expectations is driving higher levels of perfectionism, particularly socially prescribed perfectionism, where people feel immense pressure to meet others' expectations. Dr. Curran explores these themes further in his book, The Perfection Trap: Embracing the Power of Good Enough, and his widely viewed TED-Med talk, Our Dangerous Obsession with Perfectionism is Getting Worse. Today, I'm excited to dive into his insights on how perfectionism is shaping our lives, and most importantly, what we can actually do about it. Welcome, Dr. Curran.
Thank you for having me. That's a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Dr. Curran, I've been having conversations with high achievers in a variety of high-performing roles as part of this project, and what has become abundantly clear is that most of us really don't know what perfectionism is. I can tell you as a physician, I was programmed to believe that it is an essential requirement for success. Can you please break down what perfectionism is and why most of us are perhaps mislabeling it?
First and foremost, we confuse perfectionism with things like conscientiousness, meticulousness, diligence, work ethic. All of these things are wonderful. You're not going to get to the top without them, but they're certainly not perfectionism. And perfectionism contains those qualities. It absolutely does, but it comes from a place of image, insecurity about how we appear to other people, insecurity about whether we're doing enough or working hard enough. And so all of those work ethic, diligence, conscientiousness, all of those qualities are just compensations, really, overcompensations for an internal sense of lack. And that's a problem because whilst we're labeling perfectionism as a very positive, laudable trait, what's going underneath is going to create a lot of problems down the road. And it certainly isn't something that we should be celebrating.
That is really well said. And I was hearing one of your other interviews in which you sort of alluded to perfectionists operating from this space of deficit thinking. And it really stood for me like it's almost like we're running away and we're hiding all those parts of ourselves. Instead of running towards something, we're running away from something.
We're trying to free ourselves from the bondage of a inner lack, a deficit, as I mentioned. That keeps us ceaselessly searching for the next hit of whether it be accolade or validation or approval or reward or status or whatever it might be, because those things are props for our self-esteem, which perfectionism teaches us is really important, because unless we demonstrate our self-esteem to other people, then we're worthless. We don't matter in the world. And that's an exhausting way to live. You can't live like that for a long period of time because you never ever feel like you've ever accomplished, like you've ever made a difference in the world, like you ever matter or mean anything to other people. And you're going to feel very lonely, isolated yourself off from other people, and other people will cut themselves off from you. You'll feel a lot of anxiety, rumination, and hypervigilance of what other people think of you. You start to burn out in much greater measure than other people because you're constantly worried about working as hard as you can. And ultimately, you'll start to find that what you think is holding you up, what you think is keeping you going, whilst all of this other stuff is feeling like it's coming down, is the one thing that's at the root of everything. And so you'll cling on to it as dear as you possibly can, not realizing that actually it's the one thing you need to rid yourself of.
Thinking back to all the people I have spoken with in specific during this journey as I help clinicians, and they talk about imposter syndrome, they talk about severe ruminations and like the perseverating, what did I do wrong and how I could have done, and burnout, just like all of those things that you've tied. Like, I really want to reflect back that this is there. And I feel so sane when I read your work and I hear you say that.
Yeah, it's a big problem. The one thing I wanted to do with the book and the TED Talk and all the rest of it is to try to shift the conversation on when it comes to perfectionism from something that we think is a laudable trait, even though we kind of know it's got baggage and all the rest of it. Well, I call it our favorite flaw in the book because it is a favorite flaw, right? We don't necessarily think it's 100% positive, but we do think it's necessary. And to shift us conversation on, really, to focus a little bit more on the negatives of perfectionism, because the data suggests, anyway, and the data that we do in our research lab and the labs of other researchers in the field suggests unequivocally that perfectionism creates a lot of mental difficulty, but it also doesn't make us more successful. So what we're going to find ourselves in is this zone of diminishing and declining returns, which burns us out, which makes us feel tired and exhausted all the time, and that ultimately makes us less productive. If that's really, what we're interested in, more productivity through perfectionism, well, actually, in the long run, is going to make us less productive. So all pain, no gain. And I really wanted to shift the conversation onto that footing, because if we can do that, then we can start to look at other ways to strive, which are far healthier and bring a much more fulfillment.
That is exactly what I was going to ask you. Like, this correlation between performance and perfectionism, it's the zone of diminishing returns, as you talk about in your work. Because anytime I introduce this idea of enoughness, it's okay. And for myself, like when somebody introduced that idea for the first time in my life, it's almost like I had this nauseating reaction to this. Like, I cannot accept this. Like, what does this mean? Am I just going to settle? My life is going to be over. And we love that word performance. We love that word productivity. I keep getting told by my team that I should use those words on my website. And I am just starting to not like any of those words.
Productivity in the modern economy is a very nebulous term, because what does it mean to be a productive human being when the work never ends, when you're constantly just moving one task to the other without stopping? Feeling like we're contented and enough isn't about settling. It's about recognizing that work is life, that human beings want to work and they want to feel like they're making a difference and they matter to other people. And we do that through our labors. For me, anyway, if we're talking about productivity, it's not about how much you can get done, but what's the quality of the work that you can do? What are you leaving in the world? How are you making a difference to other people? Those, for me, are much bigger motivations in terms of productivity than just the amount of work I can do. And one of the things I've been doing recently, we just spoke before I came on to your podcast about how at the moment, one of the things I'm doing is starting to work with my hands again, because there's something exceptionally fulfilling about making something yourself, like actually making something tangible in the world. I've been plastering in a house because my dad's a builder, just helping him, just because I want that sensation of being productive and not tied to any outcomes, but just the fact that somebody's going to enjoy this, not even really notice it on a day-to-day basis, but nevertheless, just providing walls in a room that are going to be there maybe for 50, 60, 70 years. That in itself is a wonderful, fulfilling act. And that's what productivity is. When I'm done, does that mean that I need to do something else? No, it doesn't. I can go home and I can be happy with that accomplishment. And then I can go on to the next thing and the next thing. And my skills are constantly refining and I'm wanting to do more and I'm wanting to do better. Feeling like we're enough and content doesn't mean that we stop. It just means that we're finding fulfillment in what we do. And that's very different from the dominant cultural narrative that more is better.
Absolutely. And based off of your work, kind of like also echoing that embodied experience of doing something with your hand is just so beautiful and so remarkable. And I used to engage in that once upon a time. And now I feel like I'm just a head surrounded by a bunch of heads. And we're always like looking at like, what is the definition of done? Is like, is it actually ever done? Is done. To your point, I really want to ask you a little bit more study-wise when you talk about this perfectionism paradox, like how actually we're just not in a good place when we are looking at performance objectively also, perfectionism is just such a poor choice to aim for.
Yeah, there's loads of data that has looked at the relationship to perfectionism and performance, and they all converge to nothing, basically. Like the variance explained in perfectionism and performance is tiny, certainly no different from zero, which is what we tested to when we tested for statistical significance. So no variance explained by perfectionism in performance, which means if you're a perfectionist and you're not a perfectionist, well, your perfectionist is going to work a lot harder than a non-perfectionist, but they're not going to get as much out as a consequence. And why is that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. We touched on burnout. Burnout is obviously a factor here. Perfectionists burn out way more than non-perfectionistic people because they just push themselves way too hard. There's another, I think, more interesting reason, and that's because perfectionism, it's a psychological trait that creates a lot of anxiety, worry, and insecurity. And as a consequence, perfectionists tend to be very self-sabotaging in the way that they approach their tasks. So we've done loads of research now, putting perfectionists in stressful situations and finding out what happens. And when you subject them to failure, particularly competitive failure, they feel a lot of guilt, they feel a lot of shame in those moments because they've just revealed some imperfection. And also, when you put them in situations where you give them challenging goals and tell them that they failed, but then ask them to have another go, you tend to find on the second attempt that they withdraw their energy and behavior because they don't want to feel that guilt and shame again. So they kind of remove themselves from the situation, particularly in challenging situations. And so this is the paradox, right? This is a paradox of perfectionism. On the one hand, you've got all this restless striving, but then on the other hand, you've got all of this burnout and this self-sabotage, and they converge to mean that perfectionists are no more successful than other people. And that's a really difficult message to spread. I've been trying to do that in my advocacy recently, and lots of people kind of get it. Like they see the data and they're on board, but actually like letting it go is another matter.
Letting it go is definitely another matter, but I do appreciate the data that you are bringing front and center. I feel like we love to over-intellectualize things. So when you see a number, well, studies show, when you start the conversation like that, I feel that it lands so much better. In specific, I would love to hear your thoughts. How is glorifying being a perfectionist also a terrible idea for highly stressful professions such as those in medicine? Because when we're looking at the amalgamation of other-oriented and socially prescribed perfectionism, I feel like there's no room or margin for error or for being a human. And we must always be precise. We must always be right. I'm talking specifically about medicine right now. And if we fail, it's just so hard. I know a lot of physicians like never recover from that.
Yeah, and it's a super tough profession. You have to be diligent. You have to be meticulous. There is very little room for mistakes. And that's why there's so many safeguards built into procedures in high risk and high pressure professions. There has to be. It's the same with nuclear power. It's the same with the airline industry. There is an implicit acknowledgement in those processes and safeguards that people are imperfect and mistakes will slip through the net. And no matter how diligent or conscientious we are, it's going to happen. And as much as we try to avoid it at all costs, nevertheless, there will be isolated incidents throughout a long career where you may make a mistake, and that mistake might have quite dramatic consequences. And I think within professions like those higher risk professions is so important that we recognize that we are human beings at the end of the day, and that we're conscientious and we're diligent, and we've got through a really rigorous selection process just to be here, so that we are, very, very proficient professionals. And at the same time, recognizing too that if we overemphasize perfection at all costs, that we're actually going to run the risk of creating more of culture that creates more opportunity for mistakes, because perfectionistic cultures and climates tend to be very failure-averse. They tend to be not very good in moments of crisis because the worry and the doubt starts to slip into our minds when what we really need is a clear head. They create an aversion to making mistakes, which mean we conceal and potentially, try to disguise mistakes that have been made, or maybe not be as forthcoming with mistakes as they're made, which can create all sorts of problems later down the line when it comes to procedures and operations and all the rest of it. And so there's so many arguments against a perfectionistic culture when it comes to these kinds of professions, and an argument in favor of a culture that's open, accepting, that's safe, that allows us to share our fallibilities, allows us to share mistakes and talk about them openly so that we can learn from them and do better next time. That really should be the forefront to cultures where there's a lot of risk involved.
I really want to draw attention to what you mention and you talk about in terms of this is not a good idea for people who are going to be in crisis riddled situations. You're not going to be able to have that clarity, be able to pivot at that point. And then also the word that you used was conceal. And that is absolutely true. I don't know why the song from Frozen is going through my head right now, maybe because I have two little young girls and the part where Elsa says, conceal, don't feel, don't let them show. It comes to my mind right now.
Yeah. There's another one in Miss Rachel, which is a fantastic show. But one of the songs is about, I'm so happy and my joy is in the way I choose to feel. I just wince at that because it's a very American thing. Like, put on a brave face and if you choose, you will feel better. But it does teach children a difficult message. And that message is that if you don't feel good or you feel unhappy, that just don't show it. Change your mindset and think happy thoughts and things will be okay. And that repression of our true selves creates perfectionism more than anything else because we're putting on a front, then we're starting to project into the world a happy, productive persona that isn't us underneath. And peeling it back, I think, is really important. And being in cultures and organizations that allow us to be ourselves is so important when it comes to all sorts of outcomes, but in particular, staff well-being and productivity. So yeah, it's important. Amy Emerson does a lot of good stuff on psychological safety. That's a really good literature to look at when it comes to how this is actually done in organizations, because it's not about kumbaya and getting the guitar out and all around the campfire. It's really about, there are proper organizational steps that managers can take to ensure that their teams and workplaces are safe and that people can share anything that they want without fear of recrimination. And that should be I think the purpose of a well-functioning organization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some heavier items.
The next question discusses suicide. If this topic is triggering for you, please skip to the next question. Please call or text 988 if you need help.
So in medicine, we're globally struggling with burnout, with moral injury, healthcare workers, suicide. Specific to the US, we're having a mass exodus with physicians leaving medicine, the medical students understandably seeing what's happening to them, not wanting to go into clinical care. And at the time when we're recording this, we lose about 400 physicians per year to suicide. As a woman physician, my risk for suicide is up to 400% as compared to my counterparts in other professions living here. So while there are many factors when we talk about something this serious and complex at play, undoubtedly, I'm trying to understand where perfectionism fits in all of this. In medicine, I feel like self-selects high performers that have those tendencies. In one of your conversations, you referred to perfectionism as a chance diagnostic risk factor for a variety of mental health problems. What is your take on the mental health crisis and thoughts surrounding suicide when it comes to perfectionism?
Yeah, first of all, that's a staggering statistic. That's really sobering to hear. The risk involved in being a female practitioner in medicine is so high for suicide. I wasn't aware of that. And undoubtedly, I think, well, not undoubtedly, but there's certainly a good chance that perfectionism is at play a little bit in that data. I think it is a self-selecting field for very high-performing and high-functioning individuals. And as we've talked about, that comes with baggage. Perfectionism is a transdiagnostic risk factor in the sense that typically when you have personality characteristics or traits, there may be a set of very specific or constellation of very specific mental health difficulties that come along with that trait. But what we see with perfectionism, interestingly, is that it has quite strong correlations with a whole plethora of mental health difficulties, all the way from loneliness and social isolation to cognitive difficulties around rumination, overthinking, anxiety disorders, and then all the way to the other side to mood-related disorders like depression. Sadly, inside that data, there is also a link between perfectionism and suicide too, particularly socially prescribed perfectionism. We haven't talked about the different dimensions of perfectionism, but socially prescribed is a sense of perfectionism which comes from outside. So we feel like we have to be perfect because other people in the world around us expect us to be perfect, and when we're not, they're waiting to pounce and let us know. It's a very suffocating form of perfectionism, and left unchecked, that can lead to a lot of social isolation, alienation, helplessness, hopelessness, and then sadly worse. So the very strong correlations, that's why we call it a transdiagnostic risk factor, because there are emotional things going on which create the mood. There are cognitive things going on which create the cognitive and anxiety difficulties. And there are also social factors too, which are going on where perfectionism moves us away from other people, which creates the loneliness and isolation. And that's one of the reasons anyway why we think perfectionism is so dangerous. And maybe there's a bit of perfectionism behind the numbers that you spoke about.
Thank you for sharing that. It's oddly validating in a way, all of this. I'm trying to hold space. And as I think about stories and humans that I've interacted with, including families, as an ambassador for Dr. Lorna Breen Heroes Foundation that does a lot of work surrounding healthcare worker advocacy when it comes to suicide and all these things. And really the emphasis where I feel the perfectionism really hones in is the fear and the shame that accompanies when healthcare workers try to reach out for help. And we have to report it on licensing and regulation and all of those deterrents. And then we have that component of perfectionism right there, which was a big deal for me when I actually never wanted to seek help for my postpartum depression, because it was just like, oh, the flawless me from the outside is cracking. I really don't want to share it with anybody. I want to conceal it. So I definitely can feel what you have shared with me very deeply. I want to ask you, and this is something before the interview, because when I was reading The Perfection Trap, the first time, switching a little bit here, somebody had commented about growth mindset with not as much exuberance as I get on LinkedIn. Everybody wants to talk about growth mindset. I get it. I love positivity and all of those things, but there was something in the way you had mentioned about growth mindset that made so much more sense to me than this relentless, like you had mentioned earlier. It's this focus on, if only you could think like this and be like this, like everything would be okay.
Yeah, it's a hard read for people in America, I think, and also the UK as well to a certain extent, because it does challenge a lot of conventional wisdoms. And one of them is this idea that we are programmed to constantly grow. I don't think that's true. And one of the worries that I have with the growth mindset is not that it isn't important. It is important, particularly when we're learning new things, and particularly for children, and particularly for children from disadvantaged backgrounds. The data is very, very clear. This stuff works. Like if you can focus your cultures and climates around effort and mastery and learning, and you don't put limits onto young people's a sense of self-concept and what they can achieve within math, science, or whatever, then the data are very clear. You can really grow and develop their aptitudes in those areas. My problem with it, though, is once it becomes writ large across the whole of society as the only way to think, or the only mindset in which we can adopt, or we should adopt. And I have this problem for a couple of reasons. The main one is there's no growth under conditions of abundance. So there can only be growth under conditions of scarcity, right? That's just the way, that's by definition, that's the way it works. So growth doesn't thrive in a place of contentment, of happiness, of fulfillment, and where we are right now in this moment, right? It only thrives when we feel like we lack something, we need to improve, or in some way need to be better than we already are. And that's a problem. That's a problem, because if you constantly take a growth mindset to the way that you think and act, you're never going to find contentment, or never going to find very much contentment anyway. But the second one is that Karen Horney talked about tyrannies of should, like way back in the 40s and 50s, very overlooked thinker. Talked about tyrannies of should, that people were tyrannized by how they should behave, how they should look, how they should parent, how they should present themselves and interact with other people. Particularly this pressure weighed heavily on women. She saw it in her clinic time again. And the way that we tried to reconcile these tyrannies of should was to create a persona, a facade in which we were the person we thought we should be. We were the attractive, diligent, hard, perfect mother and all the rest of it, right? And the difficulty for women in that era was there was conflict between the way that they were told they should feel and think and behave, and the way that they actually felt. And that conflict was bridged with perfectionism. So she was the first one to talk about perfectionism, and she talked it through the tyrannies of should. I think what we're seeing today is something slightly different, and that's the tyranny of could. So there's a sense that these shoulds and duties and obligations have sort of been stripped away. We've become more equal, kind of. We become a bit more, have a social conscience, that freedoms have started to open up, and people are more free to do whatever they like. And the possibility is limitless. But that's a problem now, because instead of feeling tyrannized by the things we think we should do, we now feel tyrannized by the things we think we could do. We could be this perfect person. If we just work hard enough, we could achieve this perfect life and lifestyle. The possibilities are limitless. And that's encapsulated in the growth mindset, that if we just keep growing, we will get there. But again, it's the same problem with the tyranny of should. Just like we'll never be the person we feel like we should be, we're also never going to be the person we could be. There's always going to be something more for us to chase. And so the growth mindset, I think, while on the one hand lifting us up, also on the other hand creates a long-term unfulfilled life that's only really broken when we shed out that mindset and actually focus more on contentment, fulfillment, being happy in the moment, being more intentional about the way we live, and recognizing that we've reached a point in our careers or our personal lives where we have done what we wanted to do, and that's enough, like that we can enjoy that in some way, we can find satisfaction in that we don't have to feel shamed for that. Like, we can give ourselves permission to do that and not feel like people are judging us for slowing down or settling or whatever it might be. And I think that, again, one of the things I wanted to do with the critique of the growth mindset was just to try and move the conversation on a little bit from this kind of myopic view of growth as being good at all times to something that's good sometimes and perhaps not good other times.
I like that view a lot because it allows me place to rest. Because if I'm constantly growing, I'm just exhausted, as I have been for a very long time. And in this journey, I'm trying to find rest and the ability to permit myself to feel contentment. You're absolutely right. The tyranny of could and the tyranny of should. Like, I should feel content. That's what I'm being told by my parents and everybody else. But simultaneously, I also have a checklist that I still need to complete. So I love how you phrased that.
I'm thinking, like, wrestling with that idea for my next book. Freedom and possibility seem very positive things, and they are in a lot of ways. Sadly, you wouldn't want to live in other societies and social structures. But nevertheless, like, there is also a point at which too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. And sometimes the growth imperative of consumer capitalism is something that cannot cause just as much development and growth, but also at the same time can make us miserable. Like, these two things aren't mutually exclusive. That can happen, and I think it is happening.
I actually read an entire paragraph from the book when I was presenting for medicine grand rounds, in which you talk about the Stockholm syndrome of the soul. And I'm going to pivot a little bit and kind of ask you, because the way you view perfectionism is very different from the masses, from the other books that I've read. You're absolutely right. You're not gaslighting us with individualistic self-care that needs to occur in some hypothetical vacuum, like you said, in which all growth is good. You call perfectionism a societal problem rather than a purely individualistic trait. Can you explain a little bit more why?
I think one of the things that is really important if we're talking about perfectionism and we're going to be serious about how we solve the problem, if we agree that there is a problem, then we need to get past the very individualistic way of thinking about the problem, because what we're seeing in the data is perfectionism rise in the aggregate. And that doesn't point to a problem with individuals, that points to a problem at a societal level. Something is going on at a societal level that's creating perfectionistic tendencies to go upwards. And so I couldn't really write a book in good conscience that creates perfectionism and the solution to perfectionism as another self-perfecting labor. Like, that feels jarring to me and it feels wrong. There are things we can do in our individual lives. Absolutely. There is hope. This isn't a nihilistic perspective that it's all the system and there's nothing we can do. Absolutely not. We can, as individuals, take accountability for ourselves and try to point our compass in a different direction. The reason why I wanted to front and center the societal challenges that we face is because it's important for people to recognize that what they're trying to do in combating perfectionism will run absolutely counter to what their society needs them and wants them to do. There's a wonderful quote by the sociologist Heinrich Fromm, who said, in order for society to function, in capitalist society to function, people have to want to do what the economy needs them to do. I think what we're seeing right now, perfectionism and perfectionistic tendencies that are bound up in neuroticism that need us to continue to work and consume in ever more quantity, they're things that are very good for the economy because they create growth, but they are less good for ourselves. They create a constant sense of dissatisfaction with our existing life circumstances. They punch holes in our sense of self-esteem just so that they can be filled with material solutions. And that creates a lot of neuroticism. Social media has come along and just completely blown the whole thing out of proportion. And now we can't escape a sense that there is something more, that there is something better, that we should think and feel and behave differently or in certain ways that are socially conditioned, normally socially conditioned around material solutions. So I couldn't write this book in good conscience and not mention those factors, because I think they're so important of building awareness of what's happening, why we think and feel like this. And I think that in and of itself is very rehabilitating, because if we understand the root of these neuroses, or certainly the root of some of these neuroses, then we're in a much better place to take them on in full awareness. Whereas if we're not aware that this is happening to us and that we live in the best society of all possible societies and that it must be me who's got the problem and not the world around me that's creating these tendencies, then we can feel more distressed, not less, when it turns out that after all of this work that we put in on ourselves, we still live inside a society and a culture that is going to press on our buttons and our neuroses and our insecurities all the time. So that's why I did that. And it's a difficult read for people in the US, I think, but nevertheless, I think it is an essential one.
Thank you for rooting it in evidence, because that's what the evidence suggests with your study, and it's showing us and makes sense on so many different levels. But you're right, it's hard to reckon with that, but also you cannot ask about solutions, which kind of brings me to my next thought and question, which is because I find myself often lost. I find myself lost as a mental health advocate. I find myself lost as a mother, as a doctor, as a South Asian woman, my other many roles that I have, because what is expected of me, what I feel, and what I can do, I feel lost in there. As you mentioned, that there are things that we can do, but we can only do it from a space of awareness. What are just some of the things that you suggest that we start doing, or we can lean into control this hidden epidemic of perfectionism?
First and foremostly, it's difficult. It's not as easy as saying, here's 10 top tips, away you go, for the reasons that we've just discussed, right? There are very powerful forces out there which are always going to push you in a different direction, in a direction towards your perfectionism rather than away from it. So we've spoken about awareness, but that's why I think awareness is so important, because if we are aware that when we succumb, which we will do to our perfectionism, and we maybe will do for the rest of our lives, it's not to say that you'll ever release from some of these pressures, but being aware there is a social context allows for self-compassion, allows for us to realize that actually there is a bigger picture here. And the reason I feel like this in this moment, the reason I'm feeling like I've got to put on a bit of a facade in this moment, is because that's the context I'm surviving in. Right? And sometimes you've just got to put it on, right? That's not to say that you are a failure or that you've succumbed to those pressures to conform, but that's just to say that in that moment you needed to. But nevertheless, we can be conscious and we can be intentional on a day-to-day basis about not letting our perfectionism interfere with our lives. I think the first is that we stop seeking validation and approval. That's such a massive one. You can microdose discomfort every day to do this, right? Like, it doesn't have to be one big step change in the way that you approach life. You know, you can just send your emails without fishing for reassurance. You can go to work and over a coffee, not try to poke for whether the work you did yesterday or the week before was any good, or whether people agreed with your decision on a certain project or whatever it might be, you know, just so you can feel a little bit better about yourself in those moments that you're doing a good job. Just have the self-assurance that you are doing a good job and that you don't need to fish for that reassurance or validation, and that's going to be uncomfortable. That's why I say it's like a microdose in a bit. It's going to be uncomfortable because you're going to want to know, you want control. But sometimes we learn a lot in that discomfort. That validation was just a prop for our self-esteem, and actually we didn't need it. We didn't need it. Our self-esteem needed it. Our perfectionism needed it, but we didn't need it. Then the more you do that on a day-to-day basis, the more you just let that discomfort sit with you a little bit, the easier it becomes to live more intentionally and without concern for validation. So I think that's something that I try to do. The other thing I try to do is when I hit setbacks, which you're going to do in your life and work, it really takes over because setbacks are really bad for perfectionists. They do something creative. Just get out of that kind of rigidity of like thinking I've got to force through this now. Okay, I've hit a setback, so I've got to work even harder, right? I just like to do something creative. I like to play on my guitar or go and help my dad on the building site like I've been doing this weekend, and just make things, use my hands, do something productive in other ways that are no less enjoyable or fulfilling, in fact, in some ways more so, but nevertheless allow me just a little bit of respite to think a bit clearly about what it is that I need to do at work to repair whatever's happened. And I often come back to the task, whatever it is, as I've hit the setback with much more clarity, and also with far less self-criticism as well, because I've had time to reflect. So finding outlets is also really important. Spending time in nature is crucial. You know, as I'm getting older, I'm really finding that that's very meditative. I don't intentionally meditate, but meditation is another very evidence-based approach to coming through perfectionism. And I do that in a number of ways, but getting out in nature, both walking and on my bike, just in the moment in those activities, just spinning the wheels or walking through nature, it really helps relax me, bring down my anxiety, and particularly when I'm worrying about something which is probably stupid, but nevertheless, that's what perfectionism does. It makes you overthink. And then, yeah, like there's loads of stuff. I mean, parenting, I've got some tips for parenting if you want those. One of the things I try to do is try and reduce as much as possible screen time for my kids. It's not easy. There is times for that. And particularly when they're not feeling very well and they need soothing in ways that you mentally can't do, there is moments where you'll stick on the television and just have a respite for yourself. And there's nothing wrong with that. Don't punish yourself for that. But nevertheless, try as much as you can to limit that time, because that hyperactivity that can be created in these apps and tablets and TVs is not healthy for their long-term development. It creates a buffer between themselves and the outside world. It creates a sense that they've got to constantly get out of themselves, to distract themselves in some way. And obviously the screen time is the perfect way to do that. And in that doing so, they don't feel themselves, they don't get to know themselves. And that can create difficulties later down the line. Unconditional acceptance is really important as well. So make sure you don't tie your acceptance and approval of your kids to external factors like grades or sports performances or whatever it might be. That's so important. That teaches young people that they're only really worth something if they've done something well, and that their approval or they're worth less when they've done something wrong. And that can be very subtle as well, by the way. Parents can subtly defer approval on the expectation of more. Kids are clever. They learn that, okay, well, I got to keep going and I've got to keep working and I've got to keep achieving, right? Even though I'm doing well, I've got to keep going. And that sense of not feeling like they're ever enough for validation or approval can create perfectionistic tendencies in the long run. And I think as parents, we've also got to be human beings as well. We make mistakes. Tell your kids about your mistakes. Humanize them, laugh about them, show kids that it's okay to make mistakes, because the moment you start to become anxious around mistakes and the moment you start to show fear when things have gone wrong, again, kids learn, they see it and they learn that, okay, when things haven't gone well or we've done something bad, that's a real big problem. So I'm going to avoid that, right? And that's where aversion to mistakes starts to breed perfectionism. So there's a lot there, but I hope that that's helpful.
That was very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing those. And one specific one I'll ask is because I get to hear it all the time. What are your thoughts? Like, what can we do when it comes to like procrastination and perfectionism? One thing I know you mentioned right now was like stepping away and doing something creative and then coming back to it. But anything else that we can do better when it comes to that?
The obvious answer everyone says these days is AI, but like I just find AI makes me so machine-minded. I've tried AI to kind of break through my procrastination, but then I feel like I'm not using my brain. And then if I'm not using my brain, what am I doing? Like if everything is done by what I do with my hands by a machine, that's one thing. But now if a machine is also going to think for me, then what on earth is the point of me? So I've really had a challenge with AI in terms of breaking through procrastination and getting sort of the simpler tasks done for me. I think that like breaking through procrastination, there's a few things that have found useful. When I was writing the book, actually, I had a lot of procrastination. I worried a lot about I was going to be good enough. And I spend days just not making any progress. And one of the things that did help was turning off all the distractions. So I'd turn off the internet and I would almost go back to the old school, just open Word file and a blank page. And I would just sit down in very short bursts. I think it's called the Pomodoro technique. Basically, you set a set time. I used to do 20-minute bursts and I'd have a timer on my phone to go off in 20 minutes, and I would just focus for 20 minutes, knowing that what is going to be over in a bit, and get as much down as you can, and then have a 5-minute break, maybe go for a walk, get a drink, come back, do another 20 minutes, 5 minutes, do another 20 minutes, and then have an hour's lunch. And those 3 bursts where there's no distractions, that was when I was at my most productive. So there's techniques like that, which I've found very helpful. But the big one, you won't procrastinate if you're not worried about the outcome. So the big one is to really try to step back and see the bigger picture in these things, because I worried a lot about negative reviews, and then I published a book and I got negative reviews, and I didn't really care. So you build these things up in your mind that it's going to be catastrophic, but actually it's not as catastrophic as you think it is. So the biggest breakthrough is to realize that, and then you will procrastinate less. But there are as I said, there are techniques you can use to break through it on a minute-by-minute basis.
Thank you so much for sharing that and for all these valuable insights and the incredible work that you're doing every day and continuing to do so, and modeling from such a space of authenticity, actual authenticity, not the one that's just thrown around the internet these days. With that, any parting words of wisdom before we end the conversation for today?
I just want to say this has been a lovely conversation, very thoughtful questions, and the voice in this space that is challenging some of those conventional wisdoms. It couldn't be any more important than it is this moment in time. So thank you for the conversation. I wish you all the best in what you're going to go on to do. I'm sure this podcast is going to be incredibly successful, and the book as well. I know it's going to be great. So good luck with it all. And it's been a delight to speak with you.
Thank you, Dr. Curran. And to everyone listening and watching this, I highly encourage you to take a step back and read this book, The Perfection Trap: Embracing the Power of Good Enough. It's revolutionary, and you're going to feel seen and heard and validated like I did. This episode is part of a special series and my budding book project on unmasking perfectionism. Thanks so much for spending time with me today. Just a quick reminder, while I am a physician, I'm not your physician, and nothing in this podcast is medical advice or any kind of professional advice. Everything shared here is based on my personal experiences, and the views expressed are entirely my own. If you enjoyed today's episode, I would love for you to rate, review, subscribe, and share the show with anyone who might need a little inspiration to redefine their own version of success. I'll see you next time. Until then, keep reimagining success one small step at a time.